Welcome back to another episode of The Football Chemist, where we use data to go through football's biggest talking points without boring or confusing you with all of that technical jargon. Today, I will give you 3 concrete reasons why Manchester City will not qualify for the Champions League next season. The Champions League hopes are in jeopardy after a drab 0-0 draw against local rivals Manchester United last weekend. So, I've crunched the data, I've run the models, I've created a few different scenarios, and despite England getting one more Champions League spot than normal next season, Manchester City do not end up in the top 5 more often than not. And this is just looking at their fixture difficulty for the next 7 matches, and not even considering the fact that Pep Guardiola's side are declining in form and have got some really big injury issues. But why is this the case? Let's get into it. So in this scenario, I am basically considering that there are 4 clubs fighting for 2 spots in the Champions League. Liverpool are already mathematically confirmed, whilst Arsenal and Nottingham Forest look very well positioned to be 2nd and 3rd in the league. That leaves Newcastle, Chelsea, Man City and Aston Villa fighting for the remaining 2 Champions League spots. There are clubs below them who've got an outside chance of breaking in, but I do think it is unlikely that any of them will be able to usurp the existing clubs, especially Man City. So when we first take a look at these 4 clubs' remaining fixtures, we see that on paper it looks like City do have the most favourable run-in. Here I've shaded the different clubs in terms of the relative difficulty of each fixture, considering the club's league position, their points per game, and comparing their home or away record. As we can see here, City in the 3rd column have got a lot in that pale to dark green and very few dark reds. That shows that they don't have any hard and fast, tricky fixtures coming up, like some of their rivals do. For example, Newcastle and Chelsea both have to play Arsenal and Liverpool respectively. Both teams will be very tricky to get points against. And so this scenario only takes into account the upcoming fixtures, and here we're also assuming that all 4 teams will perform equally. So we'll come into other factors later while City might struggle, but for now, let's look at the models that I've run. So I created a few different scenarios using a few different models. It's a long and complicated process with how I got here, but if you're really interested in how I did, I'll attach the document in the comments below for you to take a closer look. But for now, let's just look at the models because I'm trying to simplify the data as much as possible so that it's very easy to understand how I got to this conclusion. So let's take a look at the first model I ran, which is based on the fixture difficulties. And just by looking at the difficulty of the opposition and considering their home/away form, we do see that Newcastle will end up finishing 4th, City narrowly behind, and Villa in 6th and Chelsea in 7th. So when we look at this, it looks like happy days for City. They'll just about eke into the top 5, and they've even got a chance of challenging Newcastle for that 4th spot. Pep Guardiola will be back in Champions League football, and despite it being a disappointing season, at least they got something to work with next season. But why is this model flawed? Because to get these points here, I was assuming that the clubs will continue their form that they've shown throughout the whole season. But this isn't factoring in recent form. For example, City have got to play teams like Everton and Crystal Palace, who have shown very strong form recently, and so are undervalued in this model, and that's why City are higher up than you might expect them to actually be in real life. So let's look at a different model now, where we look at the points gained by the opposition for these 4 teams over the last 10 games. And here, it paints a very different picture. City are now in 6th. Actually, they get the same amount of expected points as Aston Villa, but I've just put them ahead because given the current goal difference, it's likely that if City and Villa were to finish level on points, City would pick them on goal difference. But still, City are now outside the top 5, outside the Champions League spots. In this scenario, they get Europa League. So unlike the previous model, this does factor in more recent form, I suppose. But the only downside to it is it doesn't really factor in the home/away advantage. There's some teams who are much stronger at home than they are away, and there's some teams that are even the flip side. For example, Everton going to Goodison Park has always been tricky, and you'd imagine that it will continue to be tricky as they enter their final matches of the season before they move to their new stadium. So why don't we run a model where we kind of combine the 2 different scenarios? How does that table end up looking at? Well, let's take a look here. And here, not only City are missing out on Champions League football, but we see that Chelsea also miss out. And in this model, I tried to combine the 2, where I've taken the last 5 matches for the opposition at that certain venue. So for example, City's next match is Crystal Palace at home. So I've looked at Crystal Palace's last 5 away results and seen the points per game they've got and basically used that to predict the amount of points that City are expected to get and for the other 3 clubs in their remaining matches. And when we look at this model, we can see that not only are City missing out on top 5, but there is a decent cushion. This model does look like it is kind of the best of both worlds, so should be the most accurate. But the problem is, if we want to keep having recent form, we can only really take 5 matches into account. So it's a small data size, very unpredictable, and you'll have a big range of error. But when we look at all 3 of these models combined, we can see that it either looks very, very tight for City or not good at all. In 2 out of 3 of the scenarios, they're not even getting Champions League football. And this isn't even taking into account the fact that they've got both form problems and injury problems compared to the other teams that they're fighting for Champions League spots. But how bad has City's decline in form been? Let's take a look. So if you cast your mind back to August and September, City actually started the season very strongly. They won their first 4 matches and ran Arsenal very close in the infamous Humble Derby. But since then, they suffered a massive slump in form around November time. And whilst they have rebounded a bit, their form is still declining. And this is evident when we take a look at their cumulative points per game over the season. So we can see City here in their sky blue, where they start a lot more strongly than their rivals, but then we see that slump as they just go on a steady decline up until about game week 18. They recover for a few matches, but again, they're kind of flatlining and if anything going down. And it's fine to be flatlining, but look at the other teams and how they're improving. Villa has spent this graph as the worst of the 4 teams for most of it, but we're seeing a little bit of an uptick as we get to the business end of the season. Newcastle, meanwhile, are also seeing a bit of an uptick. And Chelsea have been a bit up and down. Remember back in game week 15, they had this really big peak where people thought they might challenge for the league. And whilst they're not that high anymore, they are still just about getting the results they need. City are not. And when we look at their current form and their points per game in the last 5 matches, we can simulate their expected points per game in the next 7 matches. This is ignoring fixture difficulty, just looking at these 4 teams' current form. And when we do this, yes, the numbers are a bit exaggerated, but this has City finishing 7th. This isn't even good enough for Europa League. If they want to get Europa League football, they need to win the FA Cup. In this scenario, they'll actually end up in the Conference League based on their league position. And what we see here is Newcastle and Villa continuing their form to move clear of City. Interestingly, Chelsea do also go up, despite actually having some quite poor form recently, but this is only taking into account the last 5 matches. We get a similar picture if we look at kind of the last 8 or 9, and we can draw rough lines to show how both City and Chelsea have actually been declining over the last 10 or so matches. And so however far you want to extrapolate the data, it doesn't look good for City. It does look very good for Newcastle. It looks quite good for Aston Villa, and it looks all right for Chelsea. So why has their form declined so much recently? The big issue for them is goals. Erling Haaland has had a mediocre season by his standard. He is still the league's 2nd highest scorer. The problem has come when no one else has been chipping in for goals for Man City. Because when we look at their primary goal scorers, very few of those players are in form. Haaland and Marmoush have both been scoring fairly well recently. Haaland's got 8 in his last 10 matches. Marmoush's got 5 in his last 9 for City because he's only played 9 league games for City. But Haaland is injured. He's out for nearly the rest of the season. He might come back at the end. He might not. It's still unsure. But in the next 5 or 6 matches, they're going to be reliant on Marmoush and support. And when we look at the support to Marmoush, there's so many players who are struggling for form at the worst possible time this season. Just look at this table here. Doku has gone 7 matches without a goal. Foden and Savinho has been 9. De Bruyne has been 15. These players need to pick up their goal scoring form soon. Otherwise, City are going to struggle for goals, struggle to get wins, and struggle to get Champions League football. Because not only are they struggling for form, but other than Haaland, they're missing some really key players due to injury. So obviously Haaland's stolen the limelight as the main player on their injury list, but City do have a longer injury list compared to their rivals. As we can see here, they've got 5 senior players out injured, compared to just 3 for Chelsea and Newcastle, and none actually for Villa. And when we look at the players who are injured, it just gets worse, because here in red, I've highlighted the players who started over 5 matches this season, and so players who they'll miss the most in the run-in. Rodri's not highlighted here. They missed Rodri all season, so it's not going to matter that they're going to miss him for the rest of the season, because they've already played without him for most of the season, and their league form is indicative of this. But they are of course missing Haaland, but they're also missing 3 defenders, Nathan Ake, Manuel Akanji and John Stones. When we compare it to key players that Chelsea are missing, it's only Romeo Lavia, and Chelsea have got a deep enough squad to compensate for him. And Newcastle are only missing Lewis Hall. And as much as Lewis Hall is a very good player, as much as I like him, he's one of my favourite players in the Premier League. If you haven't watched my earlier videos, he is still a left back, and so he won't be as influential as some other players. Sven Botman's another big name on this list, but again, he's not played that many matches for Newcastle this season, so it's a similar effect to City losing Rodri. And despite Haaland having a so-so season, they're still going to miss his goal. Because when we look at City's goal scorers in the league this season, we can just see how over-reliant they are on Haaland. Phil Foden's second with 7, and as we've seen before, he's not scored for a while. And then if you look at the players who are third, you've got Josko Gvardiol, who's a defender, and Omar Marmoush, who's only been there for half the season. There's going to be a lot of pressure on Marmoush to step up and fill in Haaland's boots. I'm a big fan of Marmoush. I covered him in a previous video. I think he's got what it takes to be a quality player, but there's a lot of pressure on someone who's only been at City since January. Can he fill in the goals for Haaland? I think there are very, very few people in world football who could. And so Haaland not chipping in with the goals that he has this season for the next 6 or 7 matches could dearly cost them points, and in turn cost them that Champions League qualification spot. But whilst Haaland in his goals is undoubtedly a big miss, they're also missing 3 key defenders, because Manuel Akanji, Nathan Ake and John Stones are all out injured for similar time lengths to Haaland. They may not be back at the end of the season, they may be back for 2 or 3 matches, but either way, this next run of 4 or 5 matches, City will be missing 3 defenders. That's not even their defensive contributions that they'll really miss, it's more their creative play, especially Akanji. Because when we look at this table here and we see what these 3 defenders bring to City, we can see how highly they rank in their passing stats and the influence that they got in their team. Look at Akanji here. He is in the top 5 for some really big stats for his team. He's one of the best passers. He's got the highest pass completion, joint with Ake as well. Ake is not quite as good as Akanji, but he is still up there. Stones has been struggling for a good couple of seasons, but Stones has also got the experience of fighting for titles, fighting at the top, being in those close run-ins where it's only a couple points separating them from first or second. It's a different battle here where they're fighting for 5th or 6th, but it's still nonetheless a high-pressure battle where the stakes are very high. City will miss Stones' experience, and they'll miss Akanji and Ake's quality as well. So is it really this bad for City? The models don't look good, the form doesn't look good, and the injuries don't look good either. City are in big, big trouble. Everything is working against them right now, and honestly, I never thought I'd say this about Manchester City, but they're going to need a bit of luck to qualify for the Champions League. It'd be absolutely disastrous if they're not playing Champions League football next season. It's all well and good for City to have a bad season. It happens, and it's not the end of the world that they're not fighting for the title this year. But the knock-on effects that this would have for future seasons would be huge. Pep Guardiola will enter next season under extreme pressure unless he can find that magic that has made him such a good manager throughout his career to turn things around even when the odds are stacked against him. Because if he can turn it around, he does have the quality in his squad still to get back into the Champions League spots. If he can get Phil Foden, Kevin De Bruyne, Omar Marmoush, these key attackers firing, they do have a chance. Because all in all, their squad quality, when they're on form, is still the best out of these 4 teams challenging for Champions League. But what do you think? Is it really this bleak for Man City? Can they turn it around and get into Champions League football? Please let me know what you think in the comments below and give this video a like if you like what you see. Also, please subscribe to the channel if you want to see more content like this. I'm getting ever closer to 100 subscribers. It'd be a great boost if I can get it with this video. Also, give us a follow on Instagram and TikTok if you want to see more short form content and behind the scenes stuff. I'll see you next time.